Today, Dr. Craig Evans was with us, and we talked about Christian beginnings in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Fascinating conversation. I know a lot of you wished it would have gone on much longer. Well, we do have Dr. Evans back. We're not going to talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls directly today, but a new book, another book, I should say, Jesus, The Final Days, What Really Happened, which he co-authored with N.T. Wright, who has been on the program before, and undoubtedly you've seen some of his segments on the internet as well. Dr. Evans is the distinguished professor of New Testament at the Acadia Divinity College in Canada. And I asked you in the green room, I'll ask you for the sake of our viewers, how do you qualify to be a distinguished professor? I mean, that's an interesting adjective. Is it your bearing?
I'm sure it is.
Your look?
Yeah. Well, it's a publishing record, a number of books and a number of scholarly articles and things like that. It's evaluated by the faculty. Anyway, I'm very pleased.
It's kind of like politicians who are suddenly called the Honorable. That's terrific.
I guess so.
And you're a professor of New Testament, but you also are a specialist in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And you've written this book on Jesus, The Final Days. Why did you feel it was necessary to write this book?
Well, I felt it was necessary just to clear the air, I think, because there are some ideas out there that are inaccurate, unhelpful, and some of them just plain silly. And not just the usual skepticism one would expect with regard to the resurrection, but there are some bad ideas and some silly ideas with regard to Jesus' death, why he died, and also the whole issue of his burial. Some denying that he was buried at all. Perhaps his body was just left hanging on the cross, never was put in a grave. And others wonder that, speculate that perhaps the disciples had no idea where Jesus was buried, and therefore the whole story of the empty tomb and the resurrection appearances perhaps was a fiction. So there are a lot of issues involving the last days of Jesus' life, especially his death, burial, and resurrection, that the bishop, Tom Wright, and I felt we really needed to deal with.
Yeah, well, Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 said Jesus, he died. He really died. He was buried and then he rose. Let's talk about the physical death of Jesus, which, by the way, was the final nail in the coffin in terms of him fulfilling any kind of Jewish expectation of being Messiah. Messiahs don't die. But he actually physically died. Why did he die?
Well, he died. He was crucified, and that was the worst way to die in antiquity. And from a theological point of view, of course, Jesus, he understood and knew that this was the only real solution for the human dilemma. And so for him, the Messiah would save his people by dying for them and for their sins, not leading an insurrection and not driving the Romans out of Israel, which is what many of his contemporaries hoped for.
Now, the Romans were the ones who had the authority to crucify him. If it weren't for Pilate and his permission, this process would not have taken place. You make the point in the book, and you give several good kind of observations about how Jesus' whole death was a mockery. They picked up on this king theme and compared and contrasted him to Caesar. Everything from the crown of thorns to the robe to the scepter. It was like a, and it wasn't an uncommon thing. They'd done this before.
That's right. Yeah, that was one of the things. It was one of the cruel things that was done in antiquity, and the Romans loved it, was to make sport of the victim, the person to be executed, to pay homage to this person, to bow before this person, hail Caesar, and laugh at him, and it was just all part of the fun and games that the soldiers would do.
Now, in the book, you mention reasons for the death of Jesus. You mentioned 4 or 5 of them here. But the first reason was that he aroused opposition because of the manner of his entry into Jerusalem, the Triumphal Entry, something we celebrated a few weeks ago with Palm Sunday.
When David was near death, King David, the famous king of Israel, he wanted to be sure that his son Solomon was recognized as his successor, as Israel's new king. And Solomon entered the city mounted on a mule and was led up to the Temple Mount. And so that's what Jesus has done. He has reenacted, he shows that he really is the Son of David, the Messiah who's to come. And Zechariah, the prophet, foretold that's exactly what Israel's anointed king would do. In humility would enter the city, mounted on a donkey, and would work his way uphill to the Temple Mount. And that's just what Jesus did. And there's nobody in Jerusalem that would not have understood the significance of that very dramatic act.
Even the call of the people, Hosanna, which in Hebrew is, I think, Hosanna, which means save now, had a kind of a messianic implication to it. He was now going to rout the Romans. He was now going to establish his rule in Jerusalem.
That's very true. It's interesting, Jim, that you mentioned that. That passage is in Psalm 118. Yeah. And in the Aramaic paraphrase, you might say that was the living Bible for the Jewish people in this time, that psalm was understood as telling the story of David's coronation.
Right.
And so for people to allude to Psalm 118 and say, Hosanna, save us now, and Jesus enters the city on a donkey, everybody there would know what this means. This would mean, here comes the Messiah. This is the person on whom we will pin our hopes. He will save Israel.
But then, and you make this as a second point, he acted in a very un-Messiah-like manner with the money changers and those who were doing commerce in the precincts around the temple.
Israel's king had authority in the temple precincts. Right. And part of his authority was to purify the temple. And we see Josiah, for example, he did that. And so Jesus is acting out his messianic authority right there in the temple.
But it's a challenge to the ruling priests.
Oh, absolutely. It's a serious criticism. He's saying you guys are failing in your duty, because the number one duty of the high priest is to keep Israel pure and right before God.
Now you say the third reason, and this is interesting, was his telling of the parable of the vineyard. Walk us through that.
Well, yeah, the Vineyard Parable is based on Isaiah 5, which tells the story of God lovingly caring for Israel as a vineyard and bringing the rain, and it should produce a perfect crop. And what does it do? It produces bad-tasting grapes.
Right.
And so Jesus seizes upon this parable and reinvents it. And it turns out it's not the vineyard's fault. The vineyard produces grapes. It's the fault of the caretakers, the ruling priests, who don't give the fruit to God as they're supposed to. And so he warns that they face judgment, that their stewardship will be removed. They'll be replaced with someone else who will do it right. And they perceive the threat, and they don't like it one bit.
So he's managed then to offend the ruling authorities. He's managed to offend the religious authorities. And then he manages to offend the sort of the religious culture of the day by allowing this unnamed woman to anoint him with expensive oil and wash his feet with her hair. Why do you focus in on that as a reason why Jesus died?